Sorry, I'm going to run back. I guess I didn't get the slide in there for each of these dating methods, but let's talk about a few of them. One of relative dating method is called stratigraphy, and this is the simplest form. And we talked about stratigraphy already as a cornerstone of archaeology. So again, using that law of superposition and law of stratigraphic association, which just means artifacts in the same level, probably deposited around the same time, that it's going to give us a basic order, what was deposited first, but it's not going to give us any kind of date per se. We can use seriation, which is an ordering technique. So this is where you would take an assemblage, and an assemblage is all of the artifacts that you collect from a site. We can then classify it, and we can plot out a frequency of what is occurring when, and then we can actually take those seriations and plot frequencies across the region to actually track the popularity of particular styles of artifacts. So it's pretty exciting. And then we can use palynology, which is kind of a specialized seriation looking at fossil pollens, and we can also do faunal dating, so using the bones and the remains of animals to establish an order. Now, whenever possible, we want to use absolute or chronometric dating techniques. Some are more accurate than others. Some cover relatively early sites. Some cover sites that would be later in, but they're all a little bit pricey, so it depends on how much money the project has sometimes as to which method is going to be used. Now, as we'll see as we go through some of these more popular ones, they can't be used at all sites. So for instance, dendrochronology, which is tree ring dating, can only be used at specific sites because you have to have the tree, the modern tree has to go back, and you have to create a sequence through time using wood from archaeological sites, but not all trees do this well. So it's very environmentally specific. It was developed in the American Southwest using the California bristlecone pine, and they've been able to establish about an 8,000 year sequence. We also have thermoluminescence or TL dating, and this can be used on anything that's baked, so pottery, brick, tiles, even bone. It measures the energy that's released in form of trapped electrons. So when something's fired or exposed to the sun, we say that the TL clock is set at 0. Then when the object is reheated in the lab, we can measure that intensity of light emissions, and we can gauge the elapsed duration between the original firing and the refiring. This is extremely light sensitive, so you have to collect your material when that's not going to be exposed to sun, so black plastic becomes very important at that point. A few labs perform this, so it can take a while to get the results, and the range is up to about 100,000 years. We also have radiocarbon dating, which is one of the backbones of archaeology, and it measures the rate of beta emissions from decaying carbon-14. So carbon is present in all living things, and at death, the intake of carbon stops. So this allows us to measure how long something has been dead. Now, I'm not going to go through all of the physics of this, but we can read about it in our textbook in more detail if you'd like, or of course there's some really great sites online. But again, most people will use radiocarbon dating. It's good to about 50,000 years. If we use accelerator mass spectrometry, which is specialized radiocarbon dating, then we can go up to about 75,000 years. And the problem is with many of these absolute dating techniques, we have to destroy the artifact to do the date. So it can be a little problematic, but you have to kind of suffer the loss if you want to get this time context set. Some other ones that are used are potassium argon dating. That's really used a lot in paleoanthropology because it can be used for sites that are about 100,000 to 4.5 billion. You could use it up to a site that's about 50,000 years old, but it's less accurate from 50 to 100,000. And so this is using the decaying of potassium into an argon gas. So again, good for like hominid sites, not so much for other archaeological sites. So those are just a few dating methods. There are many, many more. Interpretation, this is one of the last things that we do. What are all of these artifacts telling us? And we have some things that aid us in our interpretation. So one of the things that we use are ethnographies, and these are compiled mostly by cultural anthropologists, although there have been archaeologists that have done it. We talked about ethnoarchaeology already. But we can study modern human behavior to develop models that we can then compare to the archaeological record. So if we look at butchering of an animal, what's left behind by a modern hunter, and are we seeing something similar in the archaeological record? And if so, then chances are that was hunting, a butchering site. So that's how we can use ethnography. Experimental archaeology can be used very similarly. So for instance, if I have a site and I'm finding tons and tons of little amphibian bones, but it seems almost like too much for somebody to maybe just have been eating them, one of the things that we could do is dig a pit and just leave it open and then come back later, maybe weeks or months later, and see what we find. And maybe we find lots of little amphibians have fallen into the pit and died. And that might be one way to explain all of the little amphibian remains that I found on my archaeological site. So that's one way to use experimental archaeology. So we're using analogy. And there are two kinds of analogy. There's specific analogy, where this is where you do a particular comparison within a single cultural tradition. So there has to be some cultural continuity established, and this can be done with archaeological, ethnographic, or even biological evidence. So for instance, one of the longest sequences we have in North America is from the Anasazi to modern Pueblo peoples. We can also use general analogy. These are much broader comparisons. So we can use documents across several cultural traditions. Usually we do this when we can't apply specific analogy. So for instance, in an ideal situation, if I'm digging, let's say, in the Amazon, then I'm going to use maybe foraging societies or horticultural societies that live in the Amazon to develop models for interpretation. But if I don't have that, then I could go and use models developed from hunters and gatherers in Africa, or pastoralists in Africa, or horticulturalists in Africa. Specific analogy is always best. General analogy is more often than not what we have to use. So from all of this and using our models, we try to reconstruct the social organization, economy, and ideology, as many aspects as possible of human behavior. Now, during this analysis process, this is when we see if our hypotheses are supported, and if not, again, we might have to go collect more data and even possibly revise our hypotheses. So that's it. Very brief introduction to archaeology. Again, if you're interested in it, then you should take the Introduction to Archaeology class and check your college catalog for when that is going to be offered.